Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new Mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bells that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Derek and Eileen Severs. They were a married couple who just suddenly disappeared one day in late 1993. Because of how out of character this was for them, the police were contacted and an investigation into their disappearance began. However, what started out as a missing persons case soon turned into a double murder inquiry, and it wouldn't be long before a suspect was identified, and this suspect just completely shocked everyone. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a special thank you to BBC Sounds for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. I absolutely love BBC Sounds. I've been a regular user for ages now. It is the easiest way to listen to BBC Sounds podcasts as well as BBC Radio, and also curated music mixes for every mood. BBC Sounds is honestly a platform that I use daily. I'm one of those people that can't be productive. I can't do anything in complete silence. I need something on in the background so that I can concentrate, so I will always turn to BBC Sounds. I use it a lot whilst I'm just working on my laptop or whilst I'm tidying up. Sometimes I pop on a BBC Sounds podcast to listen to whilst I'm driving. And a podcast series that I've been listening to lately and I really want to share with you guys is Matan, Injustice of a Hanged Man. It's about the last man to ever be hanged in Cardiff, Mahmoud Matan. Mahmoud was a British Somali man who was wrongfully convicted of the murder of a woman named Lily Volpert, even though there was virtually no evidence whatsoever actually linking him to the crime. Regardless, Matan was found guilty. It's believed that racism played a major part in that, and the judge sentenced him to death, and he was executed on the 3rd of September 1952. And it wouldn't be until 45 years later in 1998 when Matan's conviction was overturned and quashed. Injustice of a Hanged Man series on BBC Sounds also explores how Mahmoud Matan's family have been tragically tormented through the generations by this awful injustice. Even to this day, the ripples can still be felt. Mahmoud's story is such a frustrating one. It was so heartbreaking to listen to this series and it did make me feel very emotional, but equally I think that this case is one that everyone should be aware of. Everyone should learn about what happened to Mahmoud and his poor family. This is such an important part of criminal injustice history. I'm currently on episode 4 of the Injustice of a Hanged Man series and I really recommend that you guys check it out. So the link to BBC Sounds will be at the top line of the description box, or alternatively feel free to scan the QR code that is on screen right now and it will take you there. Thank you so much again to BBC Sounds for partnering with me on today's video and supporting the channel. Thank you to you guys for always supporting the sponsors on this channel, and now let's just get into the case. Before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the violent murders of 2 elderly people. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back to November of 1993 in Hambleton, which is a little village located in Rutland in England. It's almost completely surrounded by the Rutland Water Nature Reserve. I believe I read that the Rutland Lake is actually Britain's largest man-made lake. It's a very beautiful and picturesque part of England. As I said, the village of Hambleton is very small. According to the 2001 census, Hambleton had a population of only about 140 people. So as you can imagine, it was very quiet, very calm, very safe. There was virtually no criminal activity. So for Derek and Eileen Severs, it was thought to be the perfect place to live whilst they enjoyed their retirement. Married couple Derek and Eileen Severs had lived in Hambleton for roughly 20 years by this point. They used to live in the city of York in the northeast of England, but like I said, about 2 decades before this case took place, they relocated to Hambleton. They lived in a little bungalow in Hambleton. Derek was 68 years old, Eileen was 1 year older, she was 69, and the couple had a son. His name was Roger. As far as I'm aware, Roger was their only child and he was aged around 38 at the time that this case occurred, and I believe he lived lived with his parents at the time in their bungalow. And Derek and Eileen were a very well-respected couple in their local community. Most people in the area knew them. They were very friendly with everyone. They had a lot of friends. Derek was kind of semi-retired by 1993. He worked as an executive at ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, and I think for the most part he had retired, but he would still enjoy working the odd day here and there. Derek was described as being a very social person. One of his favourite things to do was to go to his local pub and have a drink and a chat with the people in there. He also loved horse racing. His wife Eileen was also a very sociable person. Her title was actually Eileen Severs MBE. She had been awarded an MBE because Eileen was such a caring person and she had done so much charity work in her life. She always got herself involved in any local charity. She always wanted to just help in any way that she could. But I believe the MBE was specifically awarded for her charity work at the local prison, HMP Ashwell. I'm not sure exactly what she did, but apparently she would provide help and support to some of the prisoners there. Eileen also loved to get involved in any events being held in the area, like local fetes and activities and things like that. Derek and Eileen were just very nice people. I don't think there's any other way of putting it. They were very kind and very dependable, which is the reason why it came as such a shock to everyone when in November of 1993, both Derek and Eileen just suddenly seemed to go missing without a trace. It was the 18th of November 1993 when Leicestershire police were contacted by a couple of friends of Derek and Eileen's. They had rung the police because they were starting to get worried about the married couple, as no one had seen or heard from them for about 5 days by this point, which was incredibly out of character. As I said, Derek and Eileen were very, very sociable people. They had retired, but they weren't the type to just stay in their homes all day, every day. They were always out doing something, seeing people. And what made friends even more concerned was that both Derek and Eileen had missed appointments and events that they had scheduled for that week. They just both hadn't turned up and they didn't let anyone know that they weren't going to turn up either. I believe Eileen in particular, she had agreed to take a friend to a hospital appointment a few days before this, and she just didn't. She was a no-show and she didn't let this friend know that she wasn't going to be able to do it or anything. She was also supposed to help with a fundraising event that week. She was meant to deliver raffle prizes and she also hadn't done that, which was so not like her. It wasn't like either of them. Derek and Eileen were very reliable people, and when it got to day 5 and still no one had seen or heard from them, that was when friends decided, okay, it's now time to get in contact with the police because something must have happened. Once the police received this report, a missing persons inquiry was launched, and of course one of the first things they did was take statements from the friends who had reported them as missing. They tried to establish when exactly it was that the married couple were last seen, and their friends informed the police that the last time Derek and Eileen were seen was of course 5 days before this, on the 13th of November 1993, which was a Saturday, and they were reported missing later that week on the 18th, which was a Thursday. Now, Eileen was last seen on the afternoon of the 13th at a charity event which took place just a few miles away from Hambleton in a town called Oakham in Rutland. I believe she was last seen at approximately 1:30 p.m. as she was leaving the event, and she told friends that she was off home. Derek, on the other hand, was last seen a couple of hours after this at around 3:30 p.m. He'd been in his local pub that afternoon. He'd had a couple of drinks with his friends and they said that he left to go back home at 3:30. And then obviously after this, there was nothing. Radio silence from both of them. So after speaking to and getting as much information from their friends, the police then decided to head to Derek and Eileen's home, their bungalow, just to, I guess, double check that they weren't there. And sure enough, they weren't. However, their son Roger was. When officers knocked on the door, Roger answered, and the police informed him that they had been contacted by his parents' friends who were a bit concerned about them as they hadn't heard from them in a while. And Roger said, oh, there's nothing to worry about. My parents have actually gone on holiday. He said that they left a couple of days ago on the Monday. I think he said that they had gone to London. He dropped them off at Peterborough train station and that they were due to come back next week. And so the police asked him if he had heard from his mum and dad since then, since they left, and he said yes. He said that the day after they went, the 16th of November, his mum Eileen had rung him just to, I guess, check in, let him know that they got there safely. However, in all honesty, the police were a bit, I don't know, I don't think they really knew whether or not they totally believed this, whether they believed Roger's story. And there were a few reasons for this. Number one, like I mentioned, Derek and Eileen had arrangements and appointments with friends that week. If they were going on holiday, would they not have let their friends know that they weren't going to be able to make these appointments? That just was not like them. They weren't the type to do something like that. Secondly, when the police spoke to Derek and Eileen's neighbours, they were informed that every time the married couple had gone away before, they had always asked the neighbours if they wouldn't mind, you know, checking on the house every so often, maybe water the plants in the garden and stuff like that. But this time when they went away, they hadn't asked the neighbours to do this for them, which again was odd. There was just something about this situation that didn't quite add up to both Derek and Eileen's friends and the police, and so the detectives decided that they weren't just going to take Roger's word for it. They wanted to look into his story a bit more. And so to do this, as part of their investigation, the police followed up inquiries in both London and also Peterborough. Roger said that he dropped them off at a train station in Peterborough on the Monday and that their train was taking them to London. So the police wanted to see if they could find any evidence that proved that they had taken this route. However, they didn't find any. The police spoke to staff at the Peterborough train station and at King's Cross station in London, and not a single person remembered having seen either of them that day. The police could also find no evidence in terms of like train tickets and hotel bookings in London. There was absolutely nothing to suggest that this trip, this holiday was real. And I've said it before many times, but I will say it again, it was not in Derek and Eileen's nature to do something like this. This couple were creatures of habit. They were not the kind of people to just pick up and leave, go on holiday spontaneously. Nothing about this story made sense, and so naturally the police started to become pretty suspicious of the couple's son, Roger. If this holiday wasn't real like the police thought, then that means that Roger had lied. He'd lied about his parents' whereabouts, but why? What was he hiding? Did he perhaps have involvement in his own mum and dad's disappearance? And their suspicion towards Roger only mounted when the police were also informed by friends of Derek and Eileen, and also I think just people in the village that knew the Severs family, that Roger was pretty much a compulsive liar. I think whereas Derek and Eileen always had a very, very good reputation in the area, their son Roger kind of had the opposite. He had a bad reputation. He was just known to lie a lot and about such odd things. So for example, Roger was a regular user of the Lonely Hearts column in the local newspaper. If you don't know what a Lonely Hearts column is, it was basically like an old school Tinder. It's where single people would kind of advertise themselves in the local paper to try and find love, try to find a partner. They would have an ad where they would write about their appearance, what they were like, what they were looking for in a partner, etc, etc, and then they would wait to see if someone contacted them interested in a date. And Roger often had an ad in the Lonely Hearts column, so from this he would go on many dates with different women and he would just lie to these women all the time. You see, Roger Severs never really kept a job for very long. He was constantly going from job to job. He tried to start a few businesses before, but they never really worked out, so he never really had a stable income. But that's not what he told the women that he would go out with. He would lie and say that he had a medical degree and that he was a doctor. He'd say that he was a really successful businessman and that he had loads of money, he had a nice car, he had all this and that, but it was all just lies. The truth of the matter was that he was struggling for money so much that he had to move back in with his parents, Derek and Eileen, because he never stayed in any of the jobs that he had, so he rarely had the money to pay for a roof over his head. He was described as being quite a lazy person, to be honest. He couldn't really be bothered to work, so Derek and Eileen had to support him financially. They gave him money on many occasions. So yeah, the fact that Roger was known as a compulsive liar, combined with the fact that, you know, there was no evidence to prove that this story about his parents having gone on holiday was true, made the detectives pretty suspicious of Roger Severs. So he was actually considered a suspect or a person of interest in Derek and Eileen's disappearance. I believe it was just the day following their first visit to Roger when the detectives went to the Severs home again, and this time they asked if they could come in and just have a quick look around the home, and Roger said yes. And when they got inside, the police noticed that the house was just quite messy and untidy, which seemed strange as Derek and Eileen were known to be incredibly clean people. They took a lot of pride in keeping their home and their belongings neat and tidy. So that was a bit odd, but something that really stood out to the police when they carried on looking around the home was actually the bathroom. You see, Derek and Eileen used to have carpet on their bathroom floor, but it was clear to the officers that this carpet had very recently been ripped up and it was gone. And it was the same with the kitchen. They had carpet in the kitchen and that had been ripped up too. And so they asked Roger where the carpet in both rooms had gone, and he said that they had to get rid of them. He said that they had to pull up the kitchen carpet because his father Derek had dropped a chip pan and he'd gotten oil all over the floor, and he said that they pulled up the carpet in the bathroom again because of his dad. He said that his dad Derek had recently had a stroke whilst he was in the bath, and that this caused water in the bath to spill onto the carpet and it was ruined, so they got rid of it. But again, just like with the holiday story, the police didn't know whether or not to believe him. Were the carpets in the kitchen and the bathroom really gone because of these accidents, the chip pan and the water from the bath? Or did the missing carpets actually have something to do with Derek and Eileen's disappearance? If Roger was involved in their disappearance, was there some evidence on this carpet that he wanted to dispose of? Maybe blood evidence. Did he attack, maybe even kill his own mum and dad, and this resulted in blood on the carpet? And so he pulled them up and got rid of them in an attempt to cover up what he had done. As I said, suspicion towards Roger Severs really started to build and increase, and it only continued to increase as the investigation progressed. The police were following up different lines of inquiry relating to Roger's movement. So for example, they discovered that not long after his parents' disappearance, Roger had been spotted at a rubbish tip. So thinking that he may have been trying to dispose of evidence there, they went to this tip to see what they could find, but to be honest, they didn't really find much. They came across a towel that looked like it had some blood on it, but they were never able to link this towel to the case. I mean, back then in the early 90s, forensic science wouldn't have been able to determine whose blood it was, so they didn't know whether or not it was connected to Derek and Eileen. It could have been anyone's towel, and there could have just been an innocent explanation for why there was some bloodstains on it. Another line of inquiry that the police followed up on stemmed from a police report that had been filed just 2 days after Derek and Eileen were last seen and 3 days before they were reported as missing. You see, on the evening of the 15th of November 1993, officers came across Roger Severs, I think just on the side of the road near a kind of wooded area, and he was standing next to his father Derek's car. Derek had a blue Rover car, which was his pride and joy. So these officers asked Roger what he was doing, and he said that he had just stopped because he needed the toilet. So he was relieving himself on the side of the road. And the officers noticed that next to Roger, he had some fertilizer bags. Now, they did think that this situation seemed a bit odd at the time, so the officers did file a report about it. But of course, it wouldn't be until a few days later, after Roger's parents were reported as missing, when, again, just like the rubbish tip, they thought that this may have been a potential lead. Again, maybe Roger was actually trying to dispose of evidence by the side of this road. So a team was sent to search this area where Roger was seen that night. But again, just like the rubbish tip, they didn't really find anything of significance. But although these lines of inquiry seemed to result in dead ends, the police were still convinced that something bad had happened to Derek and Eileen. As the days went by and there was still no sign of them, they still hadn't returned from this so-called holiday, they became pretty confident that foul play was involved in their disappearance, that this couple had been murdered, and the top suspect was still the married couple's own son, Roger. The problem was, though, they still had zero solid evidence to prove this. The only evidence they had against Roger was circumstantial at best. What the police really wanted to do was get in that house, get in Derek and Eileen's bungalow, send a forensic team in, because that would probably be their best bet at finding concrete evidence against Roger and actually determining what had gone on here, what had happened to Derek and Eileen. However, Roger would not let them. He would not give the police permission to allow a forensic team to thoroughly search the property. And so the police decided to actually take a risk here and arrest him. He was arrested on suspicion of double murder because obviously if he is arrested, they don't need his permission to search the home. Another reason why he was arrested was because the police were concerned that he might try to flee the country. In fact, according to one source, he did actually disappear for a while when the investigation was heating up, when he probably realised that the police were suspicious of him. But the police tracked him down and, as I said, he was ultimately arrested and taken into custody. And this was a risk because obviously after they arrest him, they can only keep him in custody for so long before they either charge him or release him. And of course, they didn't want to have to release him because they were sure that he had done something to his parents. But if they were going to charge him, they needed stronger evidence. So whilst detectives began questioning him, forensic teams were finally sent in to conduct a thorough search of Derek and Eileen's bungalow. They were looking for any evidence that perhaps an attack or a violent struggle had taken place there. However, one of the first things that they found was actually what appeared to be a to-do list. It had been written by Roger, it was in his handwriting, and the things that he put down on this list really alarmed the police. He had written down 14 things that he needed to do, and these things seemed as though they were related to this case, related to possibly disposing of evidence. So for example, he'd written things like clean the wheelbarrow, sort out the rubbish, clean mum's car, clean dad's car, clean the bathroom, check that the fire is out, and then the very last thing on this to-do list was dump. He'd just written the word dump, and the detectives believed that what he may have been referring to there, what he needed to dump, was his parents' bodies. Going back to one of the other points on this list though, check that the fire is out. Now when investigators looked around the back garden, they discovered that someone had recently had a fire there, a smallish bonfire, and in this fire I believe they found the remnants of some clothing and also what looked like some carpet. It appeared as though this was the carpet that had been removed from the kitchen and the bathroom. Roger had disposed of it by burning it in the garden along with some clothing. So it seemed likely that this carpet had maybe blood evidence on it that he needed to get rid of, and maybe the clothes that he burnt were the clothes that he had on during the murders. But going back to the searches inside of the house, one of the rooms that the forensic investigators focused on was, of course, the bathroom. The police theorised that if Derek and Eileen were dead, they were killed, maybe the bathroom was where the crime took place. Otherwise, why would Roger have pulled up the carpet? Now, the detectives were concerned that they may not find much because, I mean, it was clear from Roger's to-do list that he had meticulously cleaned. One of the things on the list was to clean the bathroom, and if he was thorough with his cleanup effort, that might mean that there wouldn't be anything for forensics to find. But thankfully, as it turns out, that wouldn't be the case. I mean, it was clear that someone, probably Roger, had tried to thoroughly clean the bathroom, but he didn't wipe away everything. Forensics found tiny little spots of blood, most of which were so small that they were barely visible to the naked eye. But these spots were kind of like specks of blood, as if they'd come from impact spatter. So this indicated to investigators that whoever's blood this was, they had been the victim of a vicious attack. They had probably sustained a blunt force injury and had been hit repeatedly with some kind of heavy object. Now, what was interesting is that most of these blood spots were discovered very low down in the bathroom. So, like, I think they were found on the bottom of the bath and kind of underneath the toilet and on the back of some of the units. They were in places that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see unless you were really, really looking, like these forensic teams were. So, like, if Roger had cleaned the bathroom, he may have thought that he had gotten rid of all of the blood because he wiped down all of the surfaces that he could see had blood on, but he clearly didn't pay enough attention to the areas that you couldn't see as well. He didn't look at the under part of the toilet or underneath the sink or behind cabinets and stuff like that, because that's where these blood spots were found. In addition to that, the forensic team also used chemical enhancement techniques similar to luminol to try and detect where in the bathroom blood had previously been but had been washed away. And through this, they were able to determine that on many of the surfaces in the bathroom, there had been blood. So it was clear that a violent attack had taken place in this bathroom because of just how much blood there was and there had been, confirming the police's belief that at least one of them, Derek or Eileen, had been killed in there. But they didn't just find traces of blood in the bathroom. Through the chemical enhancement technique, the team also discovered that there had been almost like a blood trail along the floor coming out of the bathroom all the way to the garage. The garage was right next to the house. It was attached to the house, but to get to it from the bathroom, I think you would have had to go through the hallway and also the kitchen. And sure enough, this blood trail went through the hallway and the kitchen too, but it had been cleaned up. As I said, it was only when the chemical enhancement techniques were used when investigators could detect it. So that further indicated that an attack had taken place in the bathroom. It seemed like Roger had killed either his mum or his dad in the bathroom, and then he'd maybe dragged their body to the garage. The blood in this house confirmed that this wasn't just a disappearance case. This was officially a murder inquiry. In addition to the blood evidence, fibers were also found on the floor in the hallway of the home. They were kind of like yellow and green in colour, and at the time the detectives didn't know what they were, where these fibers had come from, but nevertheless the fibers were collected as potential evidence just in case they could have had some relevance. Another area of the house that the forensic team heavily focused on was the garage, because like I mentioned, the blood trail from the bathroom went all the way to the garage, so they wanted to see what evidence they could find in there. And again, it was clear that someone had tried to clean up in there. There was a strong smell of bleach and cleaning products, and on the garage door, on the outside of the door, there were again little tiny specks of blood, which again seemed like impact spatter, which suggested that someone had been attacked out here too. Someone had been beaten just outside by the garage. Now, the traces of blood found in the bathroom and the traces of blood on the garage door were both sent off for testing. Unfortunately, like like I mentioned, back then in 1993, forensic science couldn't determine exactly whose blood this was, but it could establish that it had come from two different people. The blood on the garage door had come from one person, and the blood in the bathroom had come from another. Two people had been attacked in and just outside of the Severs home, and of course the police believed that it was Derek and Eileen. Meanwhile, as all of this was going on, as forensic teams were searching the house, the top suspect, Roger Severs, was being questioned by detectives. As I said, they knew after finding the blood evidence that this was definitely a murder inquiry. Derek and Eileen had to be dead. However, during his interview, Roger denied it. He completely stuck to his story that his parents were just away on holiday and that he was innocent. But the police knew that this was a lie. They knew that Roger was lying and that he was the one who did this. However, the police still faced a huge issue. They hadn't found the bodies, and if they were going to take Roger to trial, they needed to find them, because of course proving in court that he was guilty of double murder when they hadn't found the victims would be a million times more difficult. One of the first places the police looked for Derek and Eileen was actually their back garden. They thought that maybe Roger had buried them there, but it was ultimately concluded that he hadn't. They weren't in the garden. So then where were they? I mean, they could have been anywhere. The county of Rutland is such a rural area. It's mainly countryside. There are so many wooded areas and fields. There was obviously the Rutland Reservoir. There were so many different places in this area where someone could hide two bodies, so the detectives didn't really even know where to start. Now, as well as the bungalow, Derek Severs' car was also searched by the forensic team, his blue Rover car, because they thought that maybe Roger had used this car to transport his parents' bodies. And just like the couple's home, the appearance of the car really stood out to the investigators. Just like the bungalow, the car was quite messy, quite dirty. There was a lot of mud on the wheels and under the wheel arches. And again, this seemed very strange because Derek and Eileen were known to be very clean people. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but that car, the blue Rover, was Derek's pride and joy. He was so proud of his car. He absolutely loved it. So he always kept it pristine. So it didn't add up that it was now not. Why was it so muddy? Where had this mud come from? Well, that's exactly what the police wanted to find out. They had a theory that perhaps the mud had gotten on the car, under the car, whilst Roger was using it to transport his parents' bodies. And traces of blood found in the boot or the trunk of the vehicle pretty much confirmed this theory. And forensics also found yellowy green fibres in the boot. They were the exact same fibres that had been discovered inside the house on the floor in the hallway. And as I understand it, it was after the discovery of this evidence when Roger Severs was actually charged. The evidence from the bungalow and Derek's car was enough to charge Roger with the double murder of his parents, and so that's exactly what they did. But of course the investigation was far from over. To make the case against Roger completely airtight, the detectives had to find Derek and Eileen's bodies, so the search continued. The police appealed to the public for help, the media started reporting on the case, and very quickly local people, members of the community, all came together to assist with the search efforts. They just wanted to help in any way that they could. As you can imagine, this tragic case really hit the community hard. Like I said around the start of the video, Derek and Eileen were almost like mini celebrities in their little village. Everyone knew them and everyone loved them, so the fact that they were missing and presumed dead, I think it really affected everyone so much. And yeah, they just wanted to do their bit to help get justice for Derek and Eileen. So not only were police officers out looking for Derek and Eileen, but so were the public. They were searching fields and woodlands. The Rutland Reservoir was searched, but there was nothing, absolutely no trace of Derek and Eileen. The police still had no clue where their bodies could be. But eventually, Derek's blue Rover car actually provided detectives with a potential clue. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, there was a whole lot of dirt and soil and mud on the car's wheels and under the wheel arches. And the theory was that this mud had come from the place where Roger had disposed of or buried his parents' bodies. So the detectives began thinking that maybe if we get in touch with an expert in soil, they might be able to establish where this exact soil from the car had come from. Because, you know, all soil is different. The kind of soil that you have in your garden isn't going to be the same type of soil that you would find in like a woodland. So samples of this soil and mud were sent off to the soil experts for examination. They were sent to Dr. Tony Brown, who was a geologist, and a couple of weeks later, the detectives heard back. Dr. Tony Brown summarized where he believed this mud and soil from the car had come from. He said the following: "The soil originates from a road verge or parking place by water used by fishermen in or adjacent to woodland with a significant proportion of oak, horse chestnut, ash and lime. The wood edge also borders onto arable fields and pastures and located on or adjacent to soils derived from Lincolnshire limestone." Dr. Brown also concluded that there were about 3 different places in and around the area that most matched this environmental profile that he had come up with. 3 places that he believed the detectives and search teams should look first. These 3 places were all wooded areas. There was Hambleton Wood, Exton Wood and Armley Wood. So now that Dr. Brown had helped to narrow down the search, officers immediately started looking around each wood, trying to look for any spot where the ground looked as though it had been recently disturbed. And it was during the search of Armley Wood when the police finally had a breakthrough. In Armley Wood, officers discovered a mound of mud and soil, and whilst one of the officers was standing, I think kind of on top of this mound or next to it, he described how it felt like the earth was moving under his feet. The ground didn't feel sturdy, if you know what I mean. So one of the officers put his hand down into this mud. He began feeling around, and as he was doing this, he actually found what he believed may have been human flesh. So excavations immediately began in this area, in this spot, and sure enough, it really was human flesh that this officer found. This was a shallow grave, and right next to it, just a few feet away, was a horse chestnut tree. Just like the expert Dr. Tony Brown described, he could tell from the soil and the mud samples from the car that wherever the bodies were, there was probably a horse chestnut tree growing nearby. It's amazing and insane how things like soil and a tree can literally help solve criminal investigations such as this. There were 2 bodies lying side by side in this shallow grave, 1 male and 1 female. These were of course the bodies of Derek and Eileen Severs, who had been missing for approximately 3 weeks by this point. When Derek and Eileen's bodies were later taken for a post-mortem, it was determined by the medical examiner that they both had the same cause of death. They'd both died as the result of blunt force trauma to the head. The married couple had been hit and beaten around the head repeatedly with a heavy object. Eileen had been hit approximately 8 times and Derek a total of 10 times, and it's believed that the murder weapon was a hammer with a circular head, possibly the kind of hammer that you would find in your kitchen, like a steak hammer, although I don't think in this case the hammer, the murder weapon, was ever found. But there was additional evidence discovered alongside the bodies in Armley Wood after Derek and Eileen were found. So firstly, I believe Eileen's body was actually found wrapped in a blanket, this yellowy green blanket, and this blanket matched the fibres found on the floor in the hallway of the bungalow and in the trunk of Derek's car, which proved that Eileen's body and this blanket had been in in the vehicle. As well as that, there was some soil at the burial site that oddly enough didn't match the type of soil that you would find in Armley Wood. So samples of this soil were sent off for examination, and it was eventually concluded that this soil had actually come from Derek and Eileen's own back garden. The police believe that Roger collected some of their soil from the garden before he took the bodies to Armley Wood, just in case he needed extra to cover them up, and clearly he did because he had used it. They could also prove that this soil had come from the Severs garden because within the soil at the burial site, investigators also found a potato. And a potato expert, didn't even know that was a thing, by the way, but a potato expert was able to confirm that the potato found at the burial site was the same type of potato, the same species of potato that the Severs grew in their garden. And as well as that, roof slates found at the crime scene were also determined to have come from the Severs home, and they had also been used to try and cover up the grave in the wood. And tyre marks found at the crime scene matched the tyres on Derek's blue Rover car. Following the discovery of Derek and Eileen's bodies, their son Roger was questioned once again. Detectives thought that maybe now that the bodies have been found, he might start to talk, he might confess, but he didn't. Instead, he just responded to every question with no comment. Regardless, the detectives didn't need his confession. They now had all of the evidence that they needed to take him to trial, which is exactly what they did the year following the murders in November of 1994. Roger's trial took place at Nottingham Crown Court, and by the time the trial rolled around, Roger Severs had actually changed his version of events. Obviously, up until this point, he had always maintained his innocence. He always stuck to the same story that he believed his parents had gone away on holiday. But by the time the trial started, his story had changed. He was now admitting that yes, he was responsible for his parents' deaths, but he claimed that this wasn't cold-blooded murder. That's not what happened. Roger's story during the trial was that he killed his parents in just a sudden fit of rage because he was angry at them, and he said that he just lost it. He could not help himself. He claimed that the murders were not premeditated. He didn't plan to kill his parents. He just did it in a moment of anger, and he regretted it instantly. He was basically saying that he was not guilty of this crime because his sudden loss of control meant that he couldn't be held responsible for his action. And so he pleaded not guilty to murder, but instead guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. However, of course, the police and the prosecution did not believe this for 1 minute. They did not believe that Roger killed his parents in a fit of rage. They strongly believed that the evidence proved that these murders were planned, and so during the trial, they presented to the jury their theorized version of events. Now, you may have been wondering throughout this video, why? We know from the evidence that Roger committed these murders, but why? Why did he do it? Well, it soon became clear to the police that Roger's motive for committing these horrific murders was mainly money. I touched on this briefly earlier, but Roger's parents, Derek and Eileen, had lent their son so much money over the years, thousands and thousands of pounds. Well, I say lent, but it wasn't really. They gave it to him. I think he was supposed to pay them back, but he never did. Derek and Eileen were pretty well off. They weren't mega rich by any means, but they had money. They were comfortable, and they'd always worked so hard for what they had. Whereas their son Roger was never willing to do that. He never wanted to work hard. He would constantly go to his parents whenever he wanted money. He set up a load of businesses with their money, which always failed because he would give up on them. They gave him money often because he would never stay in a job for very long, so he needed money for, you know, food and clothes and things. They helped pay off debts that he had. They even let him move back in with them in their bungalow because he could not afford to pay for a flat or a house or anything. Derek and Eileen had done so much for Roger. They'd helped him so much financially, and he had nothing to show for it. All the money that they had ever given him had just gone down the drain. It had been wasted. He relied on his parents way too much, and Derek and Eileen were so disappointed in him because of this. They expected so much more from their son. You know, Roger always had a very privileged life. He had a good education. He'd never had to go a day without anything. And Derek and Eileen had such high hopes that when their son was older, he would go far and achieve great things. But he never did. Roger was lazy. He could not be bothered, probably because he knew that his mum and dad could help him out. He didn't need to work. He could go to the bank of mum and dad. And it got to the point where Derek and Eileen just decided that enough was enough. They weren't going to do this anymore. And so I believe the last time Roger asked them for money, they said no. They were not lending him anymore. He needed to make his own money and stop depending on them all the time at nearly 40 years old. So it's believed that this angered Roger. He was furious at his parents for this, that they realised that he was just using them for their money and that they weren't going to let him get away with it anymore. There were reportedly many arguments between the Severs family in the lead up to this case, arguments about money and finances. But another motive that the police uncovered, a pretty big motive that Roger would have had for wanting his parents dead, was that apparently Derek and Eileen were planning on cutting Roger out of their will. Now, I don't know if this was ever 100% confirmed that they intended to do this, but there was a rumour that they wanted to cut Roger out of their will. I think he was due to inherit basically everything from them as he was their only child. However, Roger actually had a child of his own too. He had a 2-year-old son with a woman that he used to date, but they were no longer together anymore. And because Derek and Eileen were fed up with Roger and his behaviour, there was a rumour that they were going to cut him from their will and instead leave everything to their grandson. So maybe Roger decided to kill them before they could do that. I also read on one source that around the time that this case took place, there was some tension between Roger and the mother of his child. He wasn't getting on with her well, and this was affecting Derek and Eileen's relationship with their grandson. So apparently they had been arguing with Roger about that, and they said to him, you go and fix this relationship with your son's mother. At least try and be civil so that we can still see our grandchild. Otherwise, you're not getting any more money from us. But again, I only read that on one source, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate that is. But I also read on another source that Roger was actually the sole beneficiary of his parents' life insurance policy. If they both died, he would have gotten thousands, and so he decided to speed things up and kill them so that he could get this money. And so on the afternoon of the 13th of November 1993, Roger Severs returned to his parents' home, their bungalow in Hambleton. Some sources say that he had been out drinking that day and he was still absolutely furious about the arguments that he had been having with his parents. He was still so mad at their refusal to give him any more money, and it's believed that when he got home, he found his mother Eileen in the bathroom and he decided to attack her. It's been theorised that maybe he had another argument with his mum when he got home about, of course, money once again, and that this argument ended in him grabbing a steak mallet, a steak hammer, probably from the kitchen, and hitting his own mum over the head with it repeatedly. He hit her about 8 times in total, and Eileen died on the floor of that bathroom. Now, Roger's father Derek wasn't home at the time. Derek was still out at the pub, and so after he killed his mother, Roger waited. He waited for his father to return home so that he could kill him too. Which, I mean, just proves that this crime was premeditated. Maybe he could argue that he murdered his mother in a fit of rage. He just lost his temper. But he could not argue the same when it came to his father. He was literally waiting for his dad to get back so that he could murder him too. And as soon as Derek did get get back, Roger attacked. It's actually believed that as soon as Derek stepped out of his car, Roger ran outside and he started hitting his dad with the hammer too. This attack took place just outside of the garage, which is obviously why blood spatter was found on the garage door. Following the murders, Roger created that to-do list of every single thing that he needed to do in order to cover up this crime. Ironically, it turns out that this to-do list was the only thing that he forgot to get rid of after he had ticked everything off. That was found just on the side in the kitchen later by the police. But anyway, after the murders, Roger got that yellowy green blanket and he wrapped it around his mother Eileen. He then dragged Eileen from the bathroom through the house and into the garage, and that's what would have caused the little blood trail through the kitchen and the hallway, and how the fibres from the blanket would have ended up on the floor. He dragged her into the garage and carried her to the boot of his father's car. I believe it was determined that he wouldn't have been able to fit both of his parents' bodies in the boot at the same time, so I think he took his mother's body to Armley Wood first. He dug the grave and then put her in it, and then he returned for his father's body. He pulled him out of the garage, put him in the car, drove to the woods and put his father Derek in the grave beside Eileen. As we know, he brought soil and roof slates from their garden to help cover up the bodies, and then after this he returned to the bungalow and began the cleanup. He pulled up the carpet in the kitchen and the bathroom because they both had traces of blood on, and he burned this carpet in the garden alongside, I think, the clothing that he had been wearing during the attack. He got a load of cleaning products and he thoroughly cleaned the house and the garage, and once he was done, he came up with a plan to pretend that his parents had just gone on holiday. But of course his plan failed. Derek and Eileen's friends and the police were able to see right through it, and as it turns out, so did the jury. The jury saw right through Roger's lies. After both sides had finished presenting their cases, the jury went off to deliberate, and when they returned, they announced that they had found 39-year-old Roger Severs guilty of the double murder of his parents, Derek and Eileen. For what he did, Roger was given 2 life sentences on the 6th of December 1994. And from what I can gather, he wasn't even given like a minimum term, so he really was going to be behind bars for the rest of his life. And so I believe that is where he remains to this day. I think he is still alive and in prison. And that concludes this case, the case of married couple Derek and Eileen Severs. A truly horrific crime, and it absolutely breaks my heart that Derek and Eileen would have died knowing that their son was responsible. Their only child, the child that they had done so much for, was now murdering them in the most brutal way, and all because of money. Roger Severs viciously killed his own parents because of money. An incredibly evil man. I was thinking whilst I was researching this one though that I've covered a few cases before that are so similar to this. There was the case of Bob and Patricia Seddon. I made a video on them earlier this year. They too were murdered by their own son Stephen, and his motive was also money, just like Roger. If I remember correctly, Stephen wanted the money from their life insurance policies. And also there was the case of the Blackwell family, which I covered in 2021. Sydney and Jacqueline Blackwell were murdered by their son Brian, and Brian's motive was money too. He wanted his parents' money. It's insane really how many cases there are like this. If you haven't watched those videos and you want to learn more about the Seddon case and the Blackwell case, I will leave a link to those in the description box. But yeah, that is it for this video. Please do let me know your opinions on this case in the comments. You guys know that I always want to hear what you have to say. Before I go, I just want to say thank you once again to BBC Sounds for very kindly sponsoring this video. If you want to listen to Matan, Injustice of a Hanged Man, or any other podcast that BBC Sounds has to offer, then feel free to click the link in the description box or scan the QR code that is on the screen right now. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye!